By the fall of 1944, the German Sixth Army had already died once. They froze and starved to death inside the ruins of Stalingrad. And then Berlin did something strange. They built the whole thing again. Same name, same number. A brand new army stitched together from fresh divisions and sent south to hold the gateway to Romania and the oil that kept the German war machine breathing. That reborn Sixth Army lasted 9 days. In late August, on the dry plains between the rivers of eastern Romania, the Red Army sprang a trap so clean and so fast that an entire German army group simply ceased to exist. And helping to slam that trap shut was a brand new Soviet gun. A long, low, mean-looking field piece that could reach out and tear the front armor off a Panther tank from over half a mile away. The Germans had never faced anything quite like it in this role. They were about to. This is the story of the BS-3 100mm gun and the second death of Hitler's Sixth Army. But this story does not start in Romania. It starts years earlier, in a gun factory on the banks of the Volga, with a problem the Red Army could not solve. Go back to the 1930s. The Soviet Union was racing to build an army from almost nothing, and one of the men they leaned on hardest was a designer named Vasily Grobin. Grobin ran a design bureau at Artillery Factory No. 92 in the city of Gorky on the Volga River. He was not a quiet office engineer. He was a driven, stubborn man who believed a gun should be simple to build, tough in the field, and produced by the thousands. While other designers fussed over perfect prototypes, Grobin obsessed over how to stamp, cast, and weld a weapon fast enough to arm a country the size of a continent. His first big gun was the F-22, a 76mm divisional cannon adopted in 1936. It was a solid weapon for its day. But here is a detail that tells you everything about how the early war went for the Soviet Union. When the Germans invaded in 1941, they captured huge numbers of these F-22 guns sitting in Soviet depots and overrun positions. And rather than scrap them, the Germans rebored the chambers, modified the carriages, and turned Grobin's own gun around to use as an anti-tank weapon against the very army that built it. They called it the Pak-36 Recovered. For a while, one of the best tank killers the Germans had on the Eastern Front was a captured Soviet design. That stings. And it points straight at the deeper problem. Grobin kept improving. His bureau turned out the F-22 USV, then a light 57mm anti-tank gun called the ZIS-2, and then the weapon that made him famous, the ZIS-3. The ZIS-3 was a 76mm divisional gun that married a powerful barrel to a light carriage with a muzzle brake on the end. It was cheap, it was fast to build, and it was everywhere. Grobin actually started building it without official permission and hid the prototype until he could prove it worked. When Stalin finally saw it fire, he is said to have called it a masterpiece of artillery design. Before the war ended, Soviet factories pumped out more than 100,000 ZIS-3s. It became the most numerous field gun the Red Army owned. So the Soviets could make guns, brilliant guns, by the tens of thousands. That was never the problem. The problem was that the German tanks kept getting thicker. To understand why the BS-3 mattered so much, you have to understand the slow nightmare the Red Army had been living with for almost 2 years. When the war began, the standard Soviet anti-tank gun was a little 45mm piece, the model 1937. Against the German tanks of 1941, it was good enough. A 45 could stop most of what the enemy drove at it, and a well-sighted crew could break up an attack. But the Soviets had made a costly mistake right at the start. They had a better gun ready, the 57mm ZIS-2, and they canceled it. Their own intelligence had wildly overestimated how thick German armor was about to get, and the leadership decided the little 45 would do while they chased even bigger guns that never came together in time. Only a few hundred of the excellent ZIS-2s were built before the line was shut down. So for the brutal middle years of the war, Soviet crews were stuck leaning on a 45mm gun that was falling further behind every season. Then came the monsters. The Tiger arrived with armor thick enough to shrug off shells that would have gutted any tank from 1941. Then came the Panther, with that brutal sloped front plate that bounced rounds away like rain off a roof. Soviet gunners watched their shells spark and skip off German steel and keep coming. And every time that happened, men died. The turning point was Kursk in the summer of 1943. Before the battle, the Soviets got their hands on a captured Tiger and tested their own guns against it. The results were grim. The 76mm gun on their own T-34 could not punch through a Tiger from the front at all, and could only crack the side at suicidally close range. After Kursk, where Tigers and Panthers clawed through Soviet defenses, the message was impossible to ignore. The Red Army needed bigger guns, and it needed them now. They rushed the cancelled 57mm ZIS-2 back into production. But even that fine gun, against a Panther's frontal armor at any real distance, was bringing a knife to a tank fight. The Red Army needed something with far more weight behind the punch. They needed a hammer. And once again, they turned to Graben. The answer came from an unlikely place, out at sea. The Soviet Navy had a 100mm gun called the B-34, designed to be mounted on warships and fire at enemy ships and aircraft. It was a powerful piece with a long barrel and a heavy shell. In the spring of 1943, Graben sent a memo straight to Stalin. Bring back the 57mm ZIS-2, yes, but also let me build something heavier. Let me take that 100mm naval round and put it on wheels. Let me build a field gun that can kill anything the Germans have. Stalin said yes. Graben's team took the heart of that naval cannon and built a field carriage around it. 2 long, split trail legs that spread out behind it like a wishbone. A low silhouette so it could hide in the grass and the folds of the ground. And a muzzle brake on the end of the barrel to tame the savage recoil of a shell that big. It was classic Graben. Take a proven, powerful barrel, wrap it in the simplest carriage that could survive the punishment, and get it to the front. They called it the BS-3, the 100mm field gun, model 1944. And here is what made it special. When that gun fired an armor-piercing round, the shell left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. That is fast. Faster than almost anything the Soviets had fielded against tanks before. At that speed, the shell hit German armor with enormous energy concentrated on a small point. At a range of around 1,000 yards, it could punch through roughly 6.5 inches of solid steel. Let me put that in plain terms. A Panther's front plate was tough, but it was not 6.5 inches of flat steel. The BS-3 could defeat a Panther from the front at ranges where the Panther crew could barely make out what was shooting at them. It could kill a Tiger. It could even crack the turret of the monstrous Tiger II at closer range, and almost nothing the Soviets towed could reliably do that. A trained crew of 6 to 8 men could put 8 to 10 of these shells downrange every minute. Aimed fire, heavy fire, the kind of fire that turns a tank attack into a graveyard. But here is the detail that everyone needs to understand, because it is where most tellings of this story get it wrong. In August of 1944, this gun was brand new. It had only entered production that year, and by the end of the year, barely 340 had been built. This was not a weapon that lined the fields in their thousands. It was rare. It was precious. The Red Army handed these guns out carefully, often grouping a handful of them with the lighter ZIS-3s inside the artillery brigades of the tank armies, where the heaviest, longest-reaching gun could anchor the whole line. It was the sharpened tip of the spear, not the whole spear. So when we talk about the BS-3 at the Second Battle for Romania, we are not talking about a wall of 100mm guns. We are talking about a small number of the deadliest direct-fire weapons the Red Army owned, handed to the best crews, and pointed at the most dangerous German armor on the field. When a German tank column tried to break out of the trap that was closing around them, this was the gun waiting to make sure they did not. And that trap was about to become one of the most complete victories of the entire war. Let me set the scene. By the summer of 1944, the southern end of the Eastern Front ran through Romania. This was the prize. Romania held the Ploiesti oil fields, and Ploiesti was the single most important source of natural oil that Germany had. You cannot overstate how much this mattered. Tanks need fuel. Planes need fuel. Trucks need fuel. For most of the war, Romanian oil supplied somewhere between a fifth and a third of everything Germany burned. And once the German push toward the Caucasus oil fields failed in 1942, Ploiesti became even more vital. Hitler himself told Mussolini that the life of the Axis depended on those oil fields. That was not propaganda. It was the simple math of a war machine that ran on fuel it did not have enough of. The Americans understood it too, which is why their bombers flew long, bloody raids deep into Romania to try to choke those refineries from the air. But bombing could only slow the flow. To actually shut the taps, somebody had to take the ground. And by the summer of 1944, the Red Army was close enough to try. Lose Romania, and the German war machine starts running on fumes. Guarding that prize was a force called Army Group South Ukraine, under the command of Field Marshal Johannes Friesner. At its core was the rebuilt 6th Army, led by General Maximilian Freder Pico. And holding the long flanks on either side were two Romanian armies, the 3rd and the 4th. That last part matters more than anything. The Germans had stiffened their line by leaning on their Romanian allies. But the Romanians were tired. They had been bled white fighting a war that was not really theirs, for a cause they no longer believed in. Their equipment was old. Their morale was cracking. Many of them looked at the German troops beside them and saw not partners, but the reason their country was being bombed and invaded. And the Soviet generals planning the offensive could see exactly where the wall was weakest. Two Soviet fronts were assigned to break it. The Second Ukrainian Front under General Rodion Malinovsky to the north, and the Third Ukrainian Front under General Fyodor Tolbukin to the south. Between them, they massed over 1.25 million men and nearly 1,900 tanks and assault guns. The plan was simple in shape and ruthless in execution. Do not batter your head against the strong German center. Smash through the weak Romanian flanks on both sides, then race inward and link up behind the Germans, sealing them in a ring of steel. It was the lesson of Stalingrad, learned and sharpened, and aimed at the very army that had once been the victim of it. On the 20th of August, the guns opened up. The Soviet artillery preparation was a thing of horror for anyone on the receiving end. Thousands of guns firing at once. The earth itself seemed to come apart. And when that storm lifted, the Soviet infantry and tanks rolled forward into the smoke. The Romanian 3rd and 4th armies, holding those critical flanks, did not just bend. They broke. Within a day, the shoulders of the German position were caving in on both sides at once. This is where the new gun earned its place in the story. As the breakthrough widened, German armor tried to do what German armor always did: counterattack to seal the gap and stop the bleeding. Panthers and other tanks rolled forward to plug the holes torn in the line, and waiting for them, dug in along the breakthrough corridors, were Soviet anti-tank crews. Among them, the men with the BS-3. Picture it from the German side. You are buttoned up inside a Panther, advancing across open Romanian farmland to counterattack. Your tank is one of the best in the world. Your front armor has saved your life a dozen times. And then, from somewhere in the low ground, nearly half a mile away, something hits your tank with the force of a freight train. The round goes clean through. The gun that did it is so low to the ground you never even saw it. That was the BS-3 doing exactly what it was built for, killing the heaviest German armor at ranges where that armor was supposed to be safe. Think about the men crewing that gun. 2 years earlier, their predecessors had stood behind little 45mm guns and watched their shells bounce off German steel and shatter. Now they stood behind a 100mm barrel that punched straight through the best tank the enemy could field. That is what 2 years of blood and learning had bought the Red Army. Every counterattack the Germans threw forward to stop the encirclement ran into anti-tank fire, and the heaviest, longest-reaching gun in that fight was this one. The German tanks could not punch through and reopen the line. The jaws kept closing. If you are enjoying this breakdown of how the Red Army shattered an entire German army group, take 1 second and subscribe. We dig into the Eastern Front and the weapons that decided it every single week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Because what came next turned a battle into a catastrophe. While the Sixth Army was fighting for its life against the closing Soviet pincers, the ground shifted under its feet in a way no general had planned for. In the Romanian capital, on the 23rd of August, young King Michael did something extraordinary. He had the dictator Antonescu arrested, went on the radio, and announced that Romania was switching sides. The war against the Soviet Union was over. Romania would now fight against Germany. Think about what that meant for the men of the Sixth Army. Overnight, the country they were standing in turned hostile. The Romanian soldiers who had been guarding their flanks were now either melting away or, in some places, turning their guns around. The roads, the railways, the rear areas they depended on, all of it was suddenly enemy territory. An army that was already being surrounded from the front and sides now had no friendly ground left to fall back to. And that very same day, the 23rd of August, the two Soviet pincers met. The ring snapped shut. The rebuilt Sixth Army, the army Berlin had raised from the ashes of Stalingrad, was trapped in a pocket that ran something like 60 miles deep. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were caught inside, with the Red Army on every side and a now hostile Romania at their backs. What followed was not really a battle anymore. It was a destruction. Inside the pocket, German command broke down. Units lost contact with each other. Fuel ran short, which meant the very tanks and trucks that might have carried men to safety sat dead and useless. There is a cruel irony in that. This whole campaign was about oil, and the trapped army died in part because it ran out of the very fuel it had been sent south to protect. Friesner, commanding the army group from outside the ring, could do almost nothing to help the men trapped inside. The Soviet armies methodically carved the pocket into pieces and crushed each piece in turn. Desperate breakout attempts surged against the Soviet ring. Columns of German troops and vehicles tried to smash their way east toward the retreating front. And over again, they ran straight into Soviet firepower. This is where guns like the BS-3 did their grim work in the open. A breakout column on a road is a target a 100mm gun dreams about. The lead vehicles get hammered, the column piles up, and then the whole stalled mass is at the mercy of the artillery. Few of those breakout attempts got through. Most ended in burning wrecks and surrendering men. By the end of the month, it was over. The numbers tell the story. Something on the order of 200,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. The reborn Sixth Army was annihilated, wiped from the order of battle for the second time in 2 years. Army Group South Ukraine, the force guarding the southern door of the entire Eastern Front, had effectively collapsed in 9 days. 9 days. An entire army group. Let me put that in perspective, because it is easy to let a number like 200,000 wash over you. That is more men than fit in any stadium on Earth, gone in a little over a week. Whole divisions vanished. The Soviet generals had promised a battle of encirclement, and they had delivered one of the most complete in the history of warfare. Some have called it a textbook operation, the kind of clean double envelopment that gets studied in war colleges for generations. And the consequences did not stop at the edge of that pocket. They rippled outward across the whole war. With Romania gone, the Ploiesti oil fields were gone. The taps that fed the German war machine were shut off almost overnight. Remember, this was the prize the whole German position in the south had been built to protect. The oil Hitler said the life of the Axis depended on. The American bombers had spent a year and many crews trying to burn those refineries from the sky and never fully managed it. The Red Army took the ground in 9 days and ended the problem for good. Germany had been struggling for fuel for a long time, but losing Romanian oil pushed that crisis past the breaking point. Tanks would sit idle for lack of gas. Pilots would get less training because there was no fuel to spare. An army that cannot move is an army that loses, and after Romania, the German military got slower and weaker by the month. Romania switching sides also tore a hole in the entire southern flank of the German position in Europe. With the path through Romania open, the Red Army poured forward toward Bulgaria, toward Hungary, toward Yugoslavia. The collapse that started on those dusty plains in August kept rolling for months, carrying Soviet armies deep into southeastern Europe and shortening the war. It all traced back to those 9 days, to the broken Romanian flanks, the closing pincers, the king's gamble in the capital, and the wall of Soviet firepower that made sure the trapped army could never fight its way out. Now, I want to be honest with you about the gun, because the truth is more interesting than the myth. The BS-3 did not single-handedly destroy the Sixth Army. No single weapon ever does. The destruction of that army was the work of over 1 million Soviet soldiers, thousands of tanks, oceans of artillery, brilliant planning, and the courage of men who walked into machine gun fire to close the ring. The BS-3 was one tool among many, but it was a special tool. It arrived at exactly the right moment in the war, when the Red Army finally needed a towed gun that could kill the heaviest German armor from a safe distance, and could do it again and again. Think about the long road that led to it. The little 45 that bounced off German steel, the fine 57 that was canceled too soon and rushed back too late. The shock of the Tiger and the Panther at Kursk. The captured F-22 guns turned against their own makers. Every one of those hard lessons fed into the moment Grabin put a naval cannon on wheels. The BS-3 was the new backbone of Soviet anti-tank defense, the answer to the Panther and the Tiger that gunners had been waiting 2 long years to receive. And even though only a few hundred existed in 1944, those few were exactly the kind of weapon you want when a cornered German army is throwing its last tanks at your line, trying to break free. There is something fitting about it. The Sixth Army had crawled out of the grave of Stalingrad, rebuilt and renumbered, sent south to guard the oil. And it ran headlong into a Red Army that had spent those same 2 years getting harder, smarter, and far better armed. The men who had once watched their shells bounce off Tigers now had a gun that punched straight through. The army that had once been encircled at Stalingrad had become the army that did the encircling. That is the real story here. Not just one gun, but a Red Army that had learned its trade in blood and come back stronger than the enemy that once seemed unstoppable. The BS-3 is a piece of that story you can hold in your hands. Long, low, lethal, and brand new in the summer, everything went right. The reborn Sixth Army died for the second time in the fields of Romania in August of 1944. It would never be rebuilt a third time, and the gun that helped seal its fate would go on to serve for decades, long after the war that birthed it had ended. A reminder of the summer the Red Army shut the door on Hitler's southern front and never let it open again. If you want to see how the Red Army turned the tables on German armor across the whole Eastern Front, the video on screen breaks down the weapons that made it happen. Go watch it next.